The murmur of the crowd quieted as the man in the grey suit entered the courtroom with a firm step and an arrogant smile. He had the air of someone who had already won before even starting. Beside him, an assistant carried a stack of documents as if they were weapons. At the back of the room, an older man with a straw hat in his hands and boots worn out by the mud watched in silence. That man was Samuel Morales, and that day, without knowing it, he would become a legend. Samuel was a lifelong farmer. He had never set foot in a university, but he knew the land better than any expert. His life was sown in every furrow of his farm, in every tree planted with his own hands. But now his world was being threatened. A powerful lawyer had sued him, claiming that his lands did not legally belong to him. What seemed like a simple legal conflict would soon transform into a battle between the arrogance of the city and the dignity of the countryside. Can a humble man, without education or influence, face a system designed to crush him? Can the truth survive when power disguises itself as law? This story is not just a clash in a courtroom. It is a lesson about what it really means to have roots. Stay until the end, because what happened in that room left everyone speechless. And most importantly, it could change the way you see justice forever. If you value stories where the humble triumph over the arrogant, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story. We're starting right now. Santa Esperanza was a town where the wind spoke more than the people. The dirt streets, the old trees, and the faded facades hid years of stories told in the warmth of mate and to the rhythm of the harvest. There, everyone knew Samuel Morales. He wasn't famous for his wealth or for great deeds, but for his firm silence, his unpretentious generosity, and for that way he had of looking at the sky before making any decision. Every morning, Samuel walked his land at dawn, touching the damp leaves with his fingertips, checking the furrows, caressing with his gaze the fruits that grew like children. His farm wasn't big, but it was his. Inherited from his father, who in turn had received it from his grandfather, those lands were more than just a piece of property. They were part of his identity, his history, his soul. The children of the town greeted him with respect. The elders sought him out for advice on the weather or on life. But in recent months, something had changed. The silence of Santa Esperanza had become denser, more uncomfortable. There was talk of visits to the municipality, of discreet meetings in the neighboring city, of rumors that grew like weeds in the rainy season. One afternoon, while Samuel rested in the shade of his old grapevine, a neighbor approached him with a trembling voice. "Don Samuel, they say someone wants to buy all this land. But not to sow, but to destroy." Samuel didn't respond. He just lowered his gaze, caressed the rough bark of the grapevine, and murmured, "The land is not sold when it bleeds roots." Days later, a black truck appeared in the town. Men dressed as if from another world got out of it. Suits, briefcases, shiny watches. They didn't greet anyone. They went directly to the town hall. That night, the mayor didn't leave his office. The next day, word spread there was a formal lawsuit against Samuel Morales for illegal possession of his farm. The entire town held its breath. Some couldn't believe it. Others simply lowered their gaze. Nobody wanted trouble. Samuel, however, continued his routine as if nothing had happened. He plowed, watered, sowed. But his gaze had become heavier, not out of fear, but out of the certainty that the land he loved was now in danger. One morning, upon arriving at the town square, Samuel noticed that several neighbors were avoiding him. Others watched him with pity. The murmur was constant. What if it's true? They say there are papers, that he never properly registered the property. That lawyer is coming with everything, and nobody is going to want to get involved in that mess. But Samuel didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seek allies. He only went to church every Sunday, sat in the same pew as always, and at the end of the Mass lit a candle for his deceased wife. There in front of the altar he spoke with God. He didn't ask for revenge, only justice and wisdom to face what was coming. On one occasion, the town priest approached him. "Son, are you going to let them snatch what belongs to you?" Samuel replied calmly, "Father, I sowed with love, and what is sown with love, God does not let the wind carry away." The tension in Santa Esperanza grew like a distant storm. Everyone knew that something was coming. The problem was that nobody knew how strong it would be or who would dare to face it. And Samuel, the man who never raised his voice, was beginning to prepare his soul for a silent but powerful battle. Esteban Rios was a name that commanded respect in the hallways of the capital's courthouses. Not for justice, but for fear. His record was full of victories, not all of them clean. He wore custom-made suits, a Swiss watch that shone like a trophy, and drove a black car as silent as his way of operating. Where he appeared, someone lost something. And this time his target was in Santa Esperanza. When he stepped into the town for the first time, he did so as someone inspecting a property already bought. His shiny shoes contrasted with the dust of the streets. He looked at everything with disdain, as if the land itself seemed obsolete to him. At the cafe in the center, he ordered an espresso and complained about the taste. "This is not coffee, it's dirty water," he said, not caring that Mrs. Antonia, the owner of the place, was half a meter away. Esteban soon went to the town hall. There, with a briefcase full of documents, he filed the formal lawsuit against Samuel Morales. He claimed that the farm occupied part of a poorly defined municipal reserve and that, according to updated records, those lands could be claimed for an urban development project approved by the state government. A legal technicality, yes, but Esteban knew how to turn technicalities into sentences. Upon leaving the mayor's office, he encountered some onlookers. He didn't look at them. He just took out his phone, made a call and said, "The land is practically in our hands. The old man will have no way to defend himself. This will be quick." That same afternoon, the news spread through the town like wildfire. Many felt powerless. Nobody wanted to face a city lawyer with contacts, power, and money. Some even began to look at Samuel with sadness, as one looks at someone already defeated before fighting. But Samuel was unfazed. That night, as always, he went to water his garden. He looked at the sky, sighed, and murmured, "Those who only know the papers will never understand the history of a seed." What Esteban didn't know was that, although he had the law in his hand, he lacked something more powerful, the truth of the land. And that Samuel carried in his skin. The next day, Esteban visited the farm. He did so unannounced, accompanied by an assistant and a surveyor. He strolled through the fields with an arrogant air. Samuel came out of his shed and, without raising his voice, asked, "Are you looking for something, sir?" Esteban smiled superiorly. "Just recognizing my future property. You'll soon receive the official notice. I advise you to find a lawyer, if you can afford one." Samuel held his gaze for a moment, without hatred, without fear. Then he turned to the field as if that conversation didn't deserve more words. The following days were tense. Esteban began to manipulate the narrative. He met with the mayor, with some merchants, with land registry officials. His presence became frequent, like a sophisticated shadow. He had come to win, and he didn't contemplate another possibility. And while he wove his web, Samuel continued his routine. Not out of ignorance, but out of conviction. He knew he couldn't fight on the lawyer's terms, but he also knew that the land doesn't surrender to threats. It surrenders to abandonment, and he wasn't willing to abandon it. Esteban believed he was in control. But what he didn't imagine was that, in that forgotten corner of the map, a silent old farmer was about to teach him that not everything is bought, not everything is won with power, and that there are battles that are fought with dignity as the only weapon. Before the name Santa Esperanza existed, that piece of land already had an owner. Not by signed titles or official seals, but by the sweat of the first ones who worked it. The story of Samuel Morales began long before his birth. His grandfather, Julian Morales, had arrived there escaping a fierce drought that ravaged the north. With his empty hands and an old mule, he settled on that virgin land asleep, waiting to awaken under the caresses of honest work. Julian built his house with adobe, planted the first cornfields, raised chickens and had children. Among them, Matias, Samuel's father. Over time, the Morales family became part of the landscape, like the trees that grew around them. When Julian died, Matias took over, expanded the farm, and consolidated what was already considered Morales territory, even though the documents still didn't accurately reflect every meter of land worked by generations. Samuel grew up among furrows and harvests. He learned to read with a Bible borrowed from the town priest. At 18, he already knew how to heal animals, predict the weather by the color of the sky, and distinguish the song of each bird. But what he remembered most was the voice of his mother saying, "Son, never stray from this land. Here is buried our past, and sown your future." Decades later, those words took on new meaning. With his wife already deceased and his children living in other cities, Samuel was still there, taking care of the farm as if he was still 20 years old. And it wasn't for lack of options, but for loyalty to a promise, to protect the land that was entrusted to him. One afternoon, feeling the weight of the days, Samuel went to the cemetery. He knelt in front of Lucia's tomb, his wife, and left a freshly cut flower. The wind blew softly. He spoke in a low voice, "Love, it seems they want to tear this piece of the world away from me, but I know that you are also sown here, and as long as I breathe, I won't let them erase you from the map." That same night, while reviewing an old wooden box, he found letters from his father and a hand-drawn map. There were the original boundaries of the farm, marked with precision, with names of trees that had already disappeared and annotations in the margin. Although it had no legal value, that map was a living testimony of a legitimate inheritance. In the town, the division grew. Some believed that Samuel should give in. "It's just land, old man. Better to sell it and live peacefully." Others admired him in silence but didn't dare to speak. The fear of Esteban was real. The lawyer had influence, money, and could complicate the life of anyone who got in his way. One morning, Samuel received an unexpected visit. It was Joaquin, a boy of just 9 years old who lived near the rural school. He had a drawing in his hand and bright eyes. "Don Samuel, I made this for you in class. The teacher said we should tell a true story, and yours is the prettiest I know." The drawing showed a house, a field, and a man with a hat watering a plant. In the corner, a smiling sun. Samuel observed it with contained emotion. "Thank you, son. This is worth more than all the lawyer's papers." That simple, childish, but sincere gesture reminded Samuel that the truth doesn't always need ink or signatures. Sometimes roots are enough. Deep roots that neither time nor power can uproot. And so, while Esteban strengthened his case in luxurious offices, Samuel sharpened his faith, his story, and the love for the land that saw him born. The battle had not yet begun, but the old man's heart was already ready. In the city, trials were won with evidence. In the towns, a well-told story was enough. Esteban Rios knew this, which is why he mixed both things with mastery. He not only built legal arguments, he fabricated narratives. He spoke in a measured tone, dressed impeccably, and every word of his seemed like a sentence. On the outside, he was pure courtesy. On the inside, cold calculation. The days went by, and the legal letters began to arrive at Samuel's farm. One after another, summonses, warnings, requests for documents. In the middle of all that legal maze, an official notification arrived. The trial would be held in less than a month, under the jurisdiction of an interim judge assigned by the state. That aroused suspicions. Santa Esperanza had its own local judge, a righteous but slow man who knew the history of the town well. But curiously, he had requested a leave of absence for health reasons. In his place, a young judge would arrive with a reputation for being ambitious, known for his closeness to certain law firms, including Esteban's. The town was beginning to murmur. "Doesn't it seem strange that they're changing judges right now? They say this new one comes from the capital and that Esteban has known him since college. This is already fixed." Samuel said nothing. He just kept each document in an old folder, next to his wife's Bible. He knew that the system was not on his side, but that was no reason to give up. Meanwhile, Esteban continued to move his pieces. He visited the cadastre office, and surprisingly, some documents disappeared. Old records were replaced by updated versions in which Samuel's farm appeared partially overlapping with public domain land. Official papers with new seals, but murky traces. One day at Antonia's cafe, Esteban dared to utter a phrase in front of several neighbors. Sometimes the law has to modernize what people insist on leaving in the past. The comment fell like a stone in the water. No one responded, but everyone felt it as a threat disguised as progress. That night, Samuel sat under the eaves of his house, watching the cloudy sky. It seemed that a storm was coming, but it wasn't the one in the sky. It was the one in the soul. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight of loneliness. What if he lost? What if all that effort, all that history, disappeared in the dust of a manipulated archive? While he was thinking, he heard footsteps. It was the town postman, a shy young man who never talked much. He handed him an envelope and left quickly. Inside there was a handwritten letter. It had no sender. The text said, "Okay, here's the translated text, adjusted for a US audience. You are not alone." Not everyone believes in those fancy suits. Some of us still believe in the dirty hands of hard work. Keep fighting. We're watching. Samuel held that letter tightly. He didn't know who wrote it, but he understood the message. Maybe many were silent out of fear, but there were those who supported him in silence. The next day, in front of City Hall, he saw the new judge pass by. Young, immaculate, distant. He didn't even look at him. Behind him, Esteban smiled like someone savoring an early victory. And just when everything seemed to be leaning towards defeat, an unknown figure appeared in town. A woman with a serious face, briefcase in hand, and a determined stride. She asked for Samuel Morales. When she found him, she said in a firm voice, "My name is Clara Rivas. I'm a lawyer, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to help you, without charging you anything." Samuel looked at her with natural distrust. "Why would you do that?" She replied without hesitation, "Because my father was a farmer. And if I can talk about laws today, it's because he defended his land when no one else would. It's my way of giving back." From that moment on, something changed. Lies could dress themselves in elegance, but the truth, however humble, had just found a voice. Clara Rivas wasn't an ordinary lawyer. She didn't wear flashy suits or speak in technical jargon to impress. Her strength was in the clarity with which she looked at people, and in her conviction that justice wasn't just a concept, but a daily practice. From the first moment she set foot in Santa Esperanza, her presence caused a small stir. No one understood why a young, determined outsider would come to defend an old farmer without asking for anything in return. Samuel, still wary, invited her to sit under the shade of his grapevine. She took out a small notebook and began to ask questions, not about the land, but about the history. Who worked it first? What crops were planted? Who was born here? Samuel answered patiently. It was as if Clara wanted to build a map, not of the terrain, but of the soul that lived within it. Days later, she went to the town hall. She reviewed dusty archives, spoke with tired employees, and finally found what she was looking for, a record from over 60 years ago proving the verbal cession, but documented in a notarial act, of the land to the Morales family, long before any state claim. It wasn't definitive, but it was a key piece that could cast doubt on Esteban's narrative. Clara didn't just bring arguments. She also awakened the dormant. Upon learning of her presence, some neighbors came forward with testimonies, old photos, letters, even a copy of Samuel's grandfather's will, kept by a distant aunt. All these documents began to form a puzzle that narrated something Esteban couldn't understand. A truth that isn't measured in square feet, but in generations of life. But not everything was progress. One night, Clara found her briefcase open in her room at the boarding house where she was staying. Nothing was stolen, but some documents were out of place. She didn't say it out loud, but she understood the message. Esteban had noticed her and didn't like her presence. Samuel, upon hearing this, offered her to stay at his house. She accepted without hesitation. That night, they shared dinner. Between corn tortillas and café de olla, they talked about justice, the countryside, and the invisible boundaries that separate the powerful from the humble. "Do you think we have a real chance?" Samuel asked. "I don't know," Clara replied honestly. "But it's not just about winning a trial, it's about someone, for once, telling them that they can't trample on the history of a town. Meanwhile, Esteban was beginning to feel uneasy. Clara's appearance had disrupted his plan. He began to make more frequent calls, to pressure the judge, and to look for legal loopholes that would allow him to neutralize any new evidence. He was used to eliminating obstacles, but this time he felt that there was something different. Something he couldn't control with money or influence, the conscience of the people. And that conscience was beginning to awaken. Antonia, the owner of the cafe, decorated her place with old photos of the Morales farm. The mailman, silent as always, began to deliver envelopes with messages of encouragement for Samuel. Even some young people organized a petition drive to show public support before the court. Samuel, who always walked alone on his land, now did so accompanied, not by crowds, but by small gestures that, added together, reminded him that he wasn't facing this battle alone. And while Esteban refined his strategy with the coldness of a surgeon, Clara and Samuel continued to build something stronger than any legal argument, a community united by memory, by dignity, and by the certainty that there are battles worth fighting, even if they seem impossible to win. The sky began to close earlier than usual. Dark clouds gathered like omens over the fields of Santa Esperanza. The air became thick, charged with that invisible electricity that announces storms not only of water, but of the soul. Clara looked out the window with a frown. Samuel, on the other hand, simply said, "It's going to rain hard, like it hasn't rained in years." And he was right. That night, the storm fell with fury. Wind, lightning, a dense rain that didn't just fall, it lashed. The old grapevine was uprooted. The barn where Samuel kept his tools collapsed completely. Water leaked through the roof and some animals fled in terror. Samuel and Clara, soaked to the bone, spent hours trying to save what they could. It wasn't much. When dawn broke, the landscape was desolate. What was once a corner of work and peace now looked like wounded land. Samuel stood silently, looking at the remains of his barn. He didn't cry. He just took off his hat, held it against his chest, and said softly, "The land also cries, sometimes to cleanse, sometimes to warn." Clara wanted to encourage him, but couldn't find the words. However, it wasn't necessary. Soon neighbors began to arrive, first one, then 3, then a dozen. No one spoke. They just brought nails, hammers, lumber, tarps, hands. Antonia appeared with thermoses of coffee. Joaquin, the boy from the drawing, brought a small box with screws, and so, without the need for calls, the town rebuilt what the storm had wanted to tear down. Clara watched everything with tears held back. There was the real strength, not in the courts, not in the cold laws, not in the city suits. It was in those silent gestures, in that solidarity that springs up only where there are shared roots. Later, while helping to organize the wet papers, Clara discovered an envelope forgotten at the bottom of a box. It was sealed with old sealing wax. Upon opening it, she found a letter dated 1963. It was a declaration signed by a notary of that time, attesting to the peaceful, continuous, and public possession of the farm by the Morales family since 1929. It was a simple but forceful document, a legal testimony that could change the course of the trial. "This could be the key," Clara said with a mixture of emotion and caution. No one had it registered. "It's as if the land itself had decided to show us what it was hiding." Samuel looked at her. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. "The land listens, miss. You just have to know how to wait for the moment when it speaks." That night, with the remains of the storm still visible, the town gathered in the small chapel. There was no mass. Just silence, a lit candle, and a shared feeling. Something big was coming. It wasn't just the trial, it was a confrontation between two worlds, one that sows and another that destroys. And while Esteban prepared his last legal moves, confident that power still belonged to him, in Santa Esperanza, something invisible was being woven. A quiet, firm force, fueled by memory, by truth, and by a people who, in their apparent weakness, had found their greatest power, unity. The day of the trial arrived without warning, or at least without the kind of warning Esteban expected. He had trusted that Samuel would not be able to withstand the pressure of a room full of experts, television cameras, impeccably dressed lawyers. However, as the sun began to set on the horizon of Santa Esperanza, the entire town felt as if it was standing in the same room, looking at a man who, with his silence, seemed to speak louder than everyone else. The court was set up in an austere building in the capital, far from the welcoming town. Esteban, with his calculated gait, sat in the front row, confident, while his team of lawyers began to distribute the papers, preparing their attack. It was a whole display of professionalism, of confidence in his ability to win, but Samuel was not there to compete on his ground. Samuel was there to show the world that not everything is bought with money or power. Clara arrived early, accompanied by her briefcase without making noise, but with the same determination that led her to Santa Esperanza. There was no trace of doubt in her. The young lawyer's gaze was clear, direct, determined. Samuel watched her for a moment and then, in his slow voice, said, "I'm ready. All I have is my word, and my word is the land." The trial began with a formal presentation of both cases. Esteban stood up first and in a grave voice began to unfold his narrative. He spoke of documents, land records, dates and agreements that, according to him, proved that Samuel was not the rightful owner of the farm. He made it all seem so technical, so logical. His voice was like a whip that cracked with each phrase, plunging the room into absolute silence. Then it was Clara's turn. Without grand speeches or fanfare, Clara stood up and presented her case. She began with the words that Samuel never said, but that everyone knew. "We are not just talking about land here. We are talking about stories, about memories, about generations. This is not an ordinary property. It is a piece of soul, and that piece of soul belongs to Samuel Morales." Clara presented the old record she had found among the wet papers after the storm, and while Esteban's lawyer tried to dismiss it as a document without validity, the young lawyer asked the judge, "What value does the law have if it does not defend the truth that is buried in the land itself?" The judge, visibly uncomfortable, merely made notes. The legal battle seemed to be reaching its peak, but the room began to fill with an unusual heat, as if the air were charged with something more than words. Samuel, sitting on his bench, didn't move a muscle. His face remained impassive, his gaze fixed forward. He didn't need to speak to show that his heart was determined. Everything he had done in his life, every hard work, every decision made on his land, gave him a strength that no one could understand. He was not just a man defending his property, he was a man defending his life. Esteban's lawyer tried again to undermine the defense, seeking, as was his custom, the smallest thing in each testimony. But Samuel didn't move. He didn't react. He just watched. And when it was his turn to testify, the room was so quiet it almost hurt. Clara gave him the floor, and with a simple gesture, Samuel stood up. At first, his step seemed slower than usual, as if each movement was measured. When he reached the stand, he calmly took off his hat and looked at the judge, the lawyer, everyone present. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply truth. "I don't know much about laws, Your Honor, but I do know that this land saw me born, saw me grow, and will see me die. Every furrow I planted, every tree I cared for, carries the history of my family. This is not a business, it's not a contract, it's my life." The room, full of people, fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the fall of a hammer of justice. And it was there, in that instant, when Samuel for the first time broke his calm and looked directly at Esteban, not with rage, not with hatred, only with the serenity of one who knows that the truth, in the end, always prevails. The land doesn't need lawyers to defend itself. The land speaks for itself. Esteban's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge raised his hand. The room remained in a silence that seemed eternal, and although Samuel never shouted, his words remained echoing in the air, long after he returned to his seat. The calm before the storm, the tranquility before the final judgment. The room was charged with a palpable tension, a feeling that something big was about to happen. The murmurs ceased as soon as the judge raised his hand. and the silence that followed was heavier than any legal argument Esteban had presented. Samuel Morales, a man who had spent his entire life between furrows of earth and under the relentless sun of his field, had spoken without shouting, but with a force that pierced the walls of the court. The judge, who had remained impassive throughout the trial, now seemed more bewildered. He looked at the evidence, observed the faces of the lawyers, and finally focused his attention on Samuel, who was returning to his seat without boasting of victory. He seemed calm, as if everything was already decided within him. Truth, the judge thought, does not always present itself in a perfect and orderly manner. Sometimes it is just a voice that rises when everything else is silent. Esteban, for his part, could not hide his frustration. He had come to that court with the certainty that he would win, with the confidence that the law was on his side, that the evidence and the legal technique would be enough to drag Samuel to defeat. But something had changed in the air. The force of Samuel's words had stirred something in everyone present, even in him, although he refused to admit it. The judge called for a recess, which allowed the lawyers to exchange a few words briefly. Esteban argued in a low voice with his team, pointing out documents, discussing possible strategies, but Samuel did not move from the bench. His gaze remained fixed forward, as if he knew something that others did not yet understand. Clara approached him and whispered in his ear, "You did well. They can't continue to ignore what you've said." Samuel only nodded and gave her a slight smile, one that was not of victory, but of peace. He knew that he had said everything he had to say. During the recess, several people waiting in the courtroom approached Samuel. Some patted him on the back, others offered words of support. Even the prosecutor, who had remained aloof throughout the trial, came up to him silently and said, "The people are with you. No one dares to say it, but we all feel it. This trial isn't just yours, it's everyone's." The voice of the people wasn't heard in the legal records, but that afternoon in that courtroom, it felt stronger than ever. When the recess ended, the judge returned to the bench with a serious expression. Samuel and Esteban took their places, and the atmosphere filled with an unsettling quiet once more. The judge began to read his verdict. His tone wasn't impatient, but deeply thoughtful. After hearing the testimonies, reviewing the evidence and considering the position of both parties, this court declares that the lands of the Morales family are legitimately their property. The claim presented by the plaintiff has failed to demonstrate, beyond a reasonable doubt, the validity of their allegation. A collective sigh swept through the room. The eyes of those present moved between Samuel and Esteban. The plaintiff's lawyer opened his mouth to reply, but the judge didn't allow him to interrupt. This court is clear. History, memory, and truth are elements that cannot be displaced by the mere accumulation of papers. The testimony and history of this land are evident to all who know it. Justice is served. The judge's words were like a hammer closing the trial. But it didn't just close Samuel's case, it closed, in a sense, the arrogance of power that believes it can buy everything. Esteban, who had entered the room with the arrogance of someone who believes himself invincible, was now visibly dejected. There was nothing he could do, nothing to say. Samuel's land had not only been defended in the courts, it had been defended by his own people, by his own history. The crowd, which had remained silent throughout the session, erupted in spontaneous applause. The applause began timidly, but soon turned into cheers. Clara embraced Samuel with the emotion of a battle won, but he once again remained serene. "It wasn't just my battle, Clara. It was the battle of all who continue to believe in the truth beyond the papers." The return to Santa Esperanza wasn't noisy or full of excessive celebrations. It was a quiet return, as if all that had been done was to restore what had already existed. Samuel returned to his field where the furrows awaited. The land was there waiting for him. Esteban, for his part, retreated with his tail between his legs, but he would never forget the lesson he had learned. History cannot always be subjected to the logic of power, and sometimes the most humble men have the loudest voices. The trial had ended, but Samuel Morales' story didn't need a noisy ending or a grand celebration. The people of Santa Esperanza, now more united than ever, returned to their daily tasks with the feeling of having witnessed something that marked a before and after in their lives. It wasn't just the legal victory they were celebrating. It was the victory of truth, the victory of constant work, the victory of memory that cannot be ignored by any paper or by any authority. Samuel returned to his farm as he always did. He got up at dawn, touched the earth, checked his crops and thought of his wife Lucia, who would have been proud of his determination. Life continued, and the land remained his, as it had been for generations. But something had changed. He had learned that even in a world full of procedures and cold laws, justice can find its way when one speaks with the truth and defends what one loves. Clara, for her part, returned to her office in the city, knowing that her intervention had been more than just a case won. She had learned that justice isn't measured only by papers, but by the strength of those willing to fight for what is right, even if the fight seems impossible. In the distance, in the corners of the land that Samuel cared for, a subtle vibration could be felt, almost imperceptible, the promise that the land in the end always speaks for itself. The battle had ended, but the lesson would endure forever.